At least 2,000 people packed the Colorado Capitol building's west steps in mid-March, the day before the official start of spring. Many were dressed in red, a color that's come to symbolize support for public education.
Hey, ho, poorly funded schools has got to go. Hey, ho.
In that sea of red was Jessica Eckert Penafield. She's a 6th grade language arts and social studies teacher, and she's been teaching for more than a decade.
It is such a heart-wrenching experience year after year when funds just keep disappearing and we can't properly support our kids.
Over the past 14 years, Colorado lawmakers have withheld more than $10 billion from K-12 public schools. They did it to balance the state budget year after year. They finally managed to get school funding back to the level the state constitution requires, but now, once again, lawmakers find themselves facing a budget shortfall. And educators are nervous that they, once again, will feel the pain.
We have to really think about how can we use the same materials year after year? How do we best support kids that don't have the funding to buy their own school supplies? That we have to typically, as teachers, organize and figure it out. Is it going to come from our principals who try to be supportive, but they don't have the funding? So then it normally comes out of our own pockets.
Eckert Penafield has also seen an increased need among students for tailored learning plans, and said the years of funding struggles mean schools like hers in Adams 12 don't have adequate staffing to support those kids. She's worried some will get left behind and that more teachers will burn out.
I don't understand why we need to be out here. I'm out here again. I was out here 5 years ago. Why do I need to be out here again fighting for funds when we can cut other things that could make such a difference? You know, why is it always our kids?
So as the state's budget writers inside the building debated where to pull back this year, teachers and parents outside the building were asking for no more cuts to public education. A variety of factors are putting strains on the state's finances, and lawmakers must find about $1 billion in savings, a process they have described as painful. The big-ticket items up for cuts include Medicaid and K-12 education.
It's also a process that's been more drawn out than many anticipated or hoped, as members of the Joint Budget Committee go over the tough decisions they have to make, and they're nearing the deadline to get it all done. This is Purplish from CPR News and the Colorado Capitol News Alliance, a show about Colorado politics, policy, and the 2025 state legislature. I'm Benta Birkeland. And joining me is a reporter who has quickly become our resident Purplish budget expert, Brian Eason from the Colorado Sun.
Hey, Benta. Always happy to talk state budget with you.
That's a good thing, and we are always happy to have you. The budget really has been sort of looming over everything else at the Capitol this year, and we've already talked about it a few times. The state faces a $1.2 billion shortfall.
And just to wildly condense a lot of complicated factors into a kind of quick explanation, the state is in this situation because the Taxpayers' Bill of Rights puts a hard cap on how much the state budget can grow every year. But right now, coming out of the pandemic, lawmakers spend a lot of money to invest in education and higher ed and healthcare, and now they're just soaring way above that cap.
Here's how Budget Committee Chair Jeff Bridges, a Democrat, sums it up.
People always say, well, why? Why is this happening? And the answer, short version, taper. And it is the rationing equation in taper that says the budget can only grow at inflation plus population, and the costs of what we invest in as a state go up at a faster rate than the cost of dishwashers and washing machines.
That means lawmakers are going to need to make some pretty painful cuts to keep the budget in balance. And after months of debating, we're finally starting to get a full picture of what those are going to look like.
We're taping the morning of Tuesday, March 25th, when we thought the budget would have been finalized and introduced in the Senate. We plan to talk about exactly what the JBC proposes to cut and by how much. But this year's negotiations have taken a lot longer than anticipated, The budget's delayed, so we're in a little bit of a tricky spot. So we decided to talk about their choices, the ones they've already made, and the much tougher ones they've put off until right at the very end. And if things do get settled before this episode launches, we will drop in some updates to let you know what they finally decide to do.
This is also a chance to talk a bit about the Joint Budget Committee itself, that group of 6 lawmakers whose job it is to analyze the state's spending and financial needs and somehow come up with a plan to keep it all in balance.
For months, the JBC's been going over the budget with a fine-tooth comb, looking for any savings they can find. $1 million that would have gone to food pantries, $500,000 for diaper banks, $200,000 for equine therapy for kids with developmental disabilities.
Yeah, and they keep going back and forth on the therapeutic horse program. They keep joking about, gallows humor, right? But taking ponies away from little kids.
Yeah, that's not a good look.
It's really not. But, as difficult as lawmakers say those cuts are, they really are just a drop in the bucket. The billion-dollar question is, what will they do about the state's biggest expenses? Education and healthcare. And ultimately, how will Coloradans feel those cuts?
Brian, let's take a moment to introduce this powerful committee that crafts the state budget, the Joint Budget Committee.
Yeah, there are a few things to know about it, right? The JBC, which is what everyone calls it, is made up of 6 lawmakers, 3 from the House, 3 from the Senate. Because Democrats control both chambers, they get 4 seats and Republicans get 2.
You'd think from that split, since Democrats do have 4 members on the committee, that it would just be Democrats doing what they want to do, ignoring Republicans. But this JBC committee really does work hard to try to get to consensus. And it's rare for any of the budget members to vote against the eventual bill. And sometimes that could mean the Republicans on the committee are the only GOP members in the legislature supporting the budget bill.
I think it's safe to say that they have some of the hardest jobs at the legislature. They meet all year long, they absorb huge amounts of financial and policy information, reading all of these complicated documents every day, and then they alone really set the final budget package that the other 94 lawmakers have to approve.
One thing about Colorado's budget process is that it goes through the same process as any other bill that's introduced. So introduced, gets a public hearing, and then it goes to the chamber floor and members offer amendments. What's different about this compared to other bills is that often only a tiny fraction of the overall bill ends up changing, even though they have hours and hours and hours of debate. All of the big decisions are made inside the JBC in consultation with the governor's office and also with the caucus members that sent them and assigned them to the budget committee. But it kind of comes at the end that all the other lawmakers get to publicly weigh in and vote up or down.
Yeah, after hours and hours of debates and amendments, in the end, there's not a whole lot of room to change too much, right? One thing that's interesting this year is that the JBC is running behind schedule. It was supposed to get the budget, which everyone calls the long bill.
For obvious reasons, right? Because if you've seen it printed out, it's just like this huge, I don't even want to say packet. It's just like almost a mini book or something.
Yeah, it's a nightmare. Anyway, the long bill was supposed to be officially introduced this week. Instead, the JBC has put it off for an extra week to give themselves time to make their final, hardest decisions.
I talked to one staffer about this who just said it's so highly unusual, and they can't remember when the budget has ever been delayed this long. I do remember some times when it's been delayed maybe a day, but not a week.
That's right, Benta. So even though there have been a lot of areas where they've agreed, they also keep hitting some real sticking points.
What are the biggest sticking points at this moment?
Well, for one example, there's this program that allows recent high school graduates to enroll in free college-level classes. Some on the JBC want to cut it, others want to save it. They've also debated whether the state can afford to continue paying bonuses to get nurses to work at understaffed mental health facilities or in jails.
When you listen to JBC, you realize the stakes of so many of these things they're discussing. I tuned in at one point when they were trying to decide whether to scale back the free school meals program for all students.
Yeah, that particular one has led to a lot of hand-wringing.
This is especially thorny because this is a program voters approved. The idea is to make breakfast and lunch free for all kids. There's no income restrictions, and it's been wildly popular and costing the state money. And it does feel like the JBC committee is caught between voters who said this should be a priority and then the reality, which is that funding this will come at the cost of other things that could include other school programs.
This is such a good example of something that crops up a lot in Colorado's finances. The voters approve something, but maybe they don't have a full sense of the trade-offs it involves or the cost it's going to take.
Overall, though, the JBC has managed to agree on a lot of cuts, totaling hundreds of millions of dollars on social services, transportation, state employee benefits. Brian, walk us through some of the big ones here.
Yeah, let's start with transportation. A couple of years ago, the legislature passed a bill to spend $100 million a year on transportation projects. Well, that's definitely not happening this year. The JVC cut that spending by more than 60% this year and will cut it by roughly half next year. They also pulled back almost $70 million in grants to local governments for projects like bike lanes and public transit. And now's probably a good time for a really quick disclaimer, and that is that any vote the Joint Budget Committee takes up until the moment they send it on to the legislature, sometimes they'll come back and they'll re-vote on things. So everything is in a constant state of flux. But, Bente, you also mentioned the state workforce. They're trying to cut spending there, too, by about 1.5% in all. And right now, they're not looking at layoffs or pay cuts, but they are going to leave more open positions unfilled. Yeah, and workers, they're probably going to have to pay more for their health care going forward.
In past rounds of state budget cutting, higher education has certainly taken a pretty big hit. Does it look like that'll happen again this time?
Well, they have a lot to consider in this area. I think there is pretty broad agreement on the committee that the state already wasn't spending enough. Colorado is among the lowest in the country in public support for colleges and universities. But it's still a question of how much money the state will have left after it pays for everything else it needs to. And they've been confronted with some policy decisions, too. One thing they were looking at was whether the state should keep funding scholarships for kids to attend private schools like the University of Denver. I think when that program was created, it was kind of seen as a way to provide opportunities to low-income families that they wouldn't otherwise have. But now they're reevaluating it and saying, maybe we need to save those tax dollars for public universities only.
Another key part of the budget, of course, is health care and specifically Medicaid. A big part of the expense for the state is setting the rate it pays to medical providers when they see Medicaid patients.
Yeah, this is a debate they have every year. How much money do providers need to cover the cost of delivering these services? If you set that rate too low, providers might go out of business. Or if they can, they just start turning people away if they have Medicaid. And that means that folks have more trouble getting care.
With the budget in the state that it's in, it sounds like the JBC is going further this year, not just looking at how much they pay providers, but also considering cuts into how much the program itself covers.
Yeah, one big way for the state to save money is to make the program less generous in terms of what and who it covers. The JBC has been asking questions like, should the state continue to cover adult dental care under Medicaid? If so, how much? How should the state handle coverage for long-term care for older people and folks with disabilities? If you want to cut spending on Medicaid, these are the types of conversations you have to have. But the JBC is really uncomfortable making those decisions on their own. They kind of view these things as a health policy decision that the full legislature should be making alongside the department and the Polis administration.
And we mentioned this earlier, but when the budget bill was introduced, 94 other lawmakers run a lot of amendments. They try to make changes, but it often gets amended back to look very close to the bill the JBC committee introduced in the first place. But when it comes to these decisions on things like Medicaid that really are policy questions, would lawmakers run those in separate bills then?
Yeah, they probably would be separate bills, and the JBC members are thinking it won't even happen this year. Senator Bridges basically said he wants to put lawmakers and the administration on notice to start thinking very seriously about these things over the summer so that they can be ready next year to make additional cuts.
Because JBC members have said the budget is going to kind of look like how it does this year next year, so they're expecting more of the same.
Yep, it's not great looking forward.
It's clear why lawmakers keep telling us there are no easy choices. Next, let's get into more details on K-12 funding and all the complexities that come with it.
You love podcasts to keep up with the news. Now there's an easy way to find out what's happening in Colorado every day. The Colorado Today podcast is new from the same trusted source that brings you Purplish. You'll get the top stories, on-the-ground reporting, and moments of curiosity. Follow Colorado Today for the statewide news you need each weekday on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts.
This is Purplish from CPR News and the Colorado Capital News Alliance. When you bring up budget cuts, I think a lot of people automatically wonder what's going to happen to schools.
And there's a good reason for that, right? Public schools make up 30% of the budget. That funding has a lot of support from lawmakers in both parties, but it's really hard to close $1 billion hole and not cut into it.
I should say policymakers are pretty quick to point out that overall, they aren't going to cut education spending this year. But this is one of those areas where if funding doesn't grow as much as expected, it could still feel like cuts in the classroom.
It's hard because we don't have enough pencils, we never have enough supplies or paper, and it's really hard.
That's Sam Gump, and he's a 17-year-old student at Justice High School in Boulder. Gump was at the rally at the state capitol in March, protesting against possible cuts to public education. Gump was there with his mom, Melita Pierce, who's a retired teacher from the Boulder Valley School District.
I feel like we used to have more technology, more implementing fun things in the classroom, and we were able to because we had smaller classes.
As we started out hearing in this episode, changes to education funding can come with a real cost to kids and their teachers. But just to make things nice and complicated, education funding isn't actually set in the state budget.
Nothing's easy, is it?
No, of course not.
Each year, lawmakers actually have to pass a separate bill, the School Finance Act. That's the one that lays out how education money will be doled out, and that's where they make the policy changes that can have a huge impact on how much different schools get from the state.
That will come after the budget bill is passed, but lawmakers are working on it right now as well. And in particular, they're debating whether to change how the state calculates student enrollment.
This is a big deal because most state funding is sent to school districts on a per-pupil basis. The way that it works now is the state takes a district's average enrollment over 5 years and it pays for that number. That smooths out any annual ups and downs a bit, 100 kids less this year, 100 more next year. But it also means that schools where enrollment is shrinking don't lose money as fast. And places that are growing rapidly also maybe aren't getting as much funding as they should.
I remember Governor Polis talking about this in his State of the State address back in January, that he wants Colorado to send money to districts based on their annual enrollment, not this rolling average over several years.
We have to start funding students where they're at in their schools today in ways tailored to their needs. It is truly past time to eliminate the antiquated system that funds empty chairs rather than actual students.
Colorado was already planning to move in this direction, but it wasn't supposed to happen so abruptly. So teachers and schools are really pushing back on this change. They say the practical effect, if you ramp it up and don't give them a little bit of money to get through the transition, would be $150 million less for schools.
Okay, so enrollment calculations could be one way lawmakers balance this budget. But what about the overall formula for how the state sends money to school districts?
Great question. So
I'm sure one you're very excited to answer, right?
I cannot wait. So Colorado has this giant, complicated, of course, equation that governs how the state divvies up money for school districts. It factors in things like how many students you have, how many are at risk or low income, the cost of living for staff. Last year, they approved a big overhaul to this formula that they hope will make funding more equitable between districts. But those changes are going to cost more to implement. So now, before they can even really get started on this big priority that had wide bipartisan support, lawmakers might delay it.
They were on the west steps of the state capitol not long ago, and everyone was celebrating the fact that they had finally come up with this new funding formula. There was a lot of pride that lawmakers agreed to something, so I think this will be a pretty painful decision to not implement it.
It's definitely a biggie. The JBC, again, we're talking about this on Tuesday, so
things could change.
We'll see. But they've set aside at least $150 million from the general fund for K-12 education next year. That's enough to cover the old formula. It's not enough to pay for the new formula, though. Not without creating some real problems in the future for the state education fund, which, they don't want that to run out of money. So there's yet another big dilemma lawmakers are facing. Do they implement the new formula more slowly, or do they wait another year to start it? I don't think we're quite sure yet what that's going to look like.
If they do delay this new school funding formula, which is supposed to be more equitable, supposed to give districts more money, I think there will be a lot of people pretty upset about that. And I talked to House Republican leaders about it a few weeks ago. And for Minority Leader Rose Puglisi, she said this was a top priority for the budget.
We have been continuing to echo the theme of making sure that the school finance formula that was put in place last year gets implemented, and on the sooner side, and making sure that K-12 has the funding that they need. And then let's look at the rest of the programs, but I think that needs to be the priority.
This is one of the core dilemmas for lawmakers. Do you sacrifice everything else to fund core services like schools? Or do you try to spread the pain as widely as possible to close the shortfall?
I think those are some discussions we're going to hear a lot of as this budget gets through the legislature and spends, a week in each chamber, essentially. And I did talk to Democratic leaders in the Senate about this, if they have any bright lines when it comes to the budget. And they had a different approach than Puglisi. Here's Senate President James Coleman.
I think in the conversations we've had with our caucus, what it's been is not a specific bright line, but it's been more so how do we make sure that across the board everything is funded to the capacity that we can. And so I would say that's when it comes to healthcare, when it comes to education, the focus has been on how we make the least amount of cuts across the board so that all areas are still funded.
I think a big takeaway we hear from leaders is there really isn't agreement yet on how to share this budget cut pain. Everyone at the State House, from the JBC on down, is struggling with the least damaging way to take $1 billion out of all the things the state does.
Yeah, they've been working so hard to strike the right balance here, and I hate to bring this up, but the federal government could come in and force them to rip this whole thing up if they...
Don't say that, Brian.
I mean, we've been mostly talking about the general fund, which is state tax dollars, but federal funding is almost a third of the entire budget. When you talk about Medicaid, it's 50% of most of what Medicaid spends. It's up to 90% of some of what it spends. I honestly don't see a way that this doesn't turn into a special session if we have major policy changes at the federal level.
I mean, Congress is already talking about potential cuts to Medicaid, DOGE. I think there's just so many things that are in flux right now. No one's going to want to be back at the Capitol dealing with a special session on the budget, that's for sure.
I guess I'll put a pin in my calendar to see you then.
Hi from the state capitol. Brian, I didn't want to leave you completely hanging on what the JBC decided to do to balance the state budget, so here we are in the basement Capitol press room.
Yeah, the JBC got this thing over the finish line Wednesday night. Part of the delay was that they had more than 80 other bills that they had drafted to run alongside this budget package. They didn't approve all of those, but we'll skip all of that and get to some of the more important things.
So what's the top line here of what people need to know, kind of based on what we've gone through in this episode?
Well, they eliminated a number of programs that the State House had expanded or created in recent years. It was a lot of little things, like there was this task force on kidney disease prevention. And there were a lot of bigger things, like over $100 million for transportation projects that got cut. And they did all that so that the state could absorb, as we talked about, the rising costs of Medicaid And they wanted to fully fund K-12 education one more year without having to dip into the reserves.
So backing up a little bit to talk about those two big things in the state budget, can you explain a little bit more what JBC decided to do on Medicaid? Because I know that was an area they were really worried they were going to have to scale back on.
Yeah, on Medicaid, they did try to trim some things here and there, but the bottom line is they're just going to have to spend a lot more money next year because the cost of healthcare is going up. The state is going to spend an extra $200 million on premiums next year. The Child Health Plus plan, which is for kids whose families make too much to qualify for Medicaid, those costs are going up about 20%. And the JBC was able to increase payments to medical providers a little bit, but not quite as much as they have in recent years.
We talked about K-12 funding, which is decided in a separate bill, and we did talk about that quite a bit in this episode. The JBC did agree to increase general fund spending on public education by $150 million next year.
Yeah, but that still falls tens of millions of dollars short of what it costs to fund the current school finance formula, let alone the new one that lawmakers had passed last year. So K-12 school districts, I think, are still going to be in a really tough spot for the foreseeable future. And honestly, that's all still kind of in flux. The House Speaker and others are still working on the School Finance Act. So the JBC even said, this isn't the final word on this. We really don't know what school funding is going to look like next year.
Speaking of schools, let's talk about the fate of Colorado's voter-approved free school lunch and breakfast program. And that took a hit.
Yeah, so they cut about $34 million from that program. That leaves enough funds to keep it going through December. And the plan there is that lawmakers now have time to go back to the voters this November and ask on the ballot to raise taxes to fund this free lunch program.
If not, it'll be scaled back, I guess, after December. What else? What about equine therapy for kids?
I am happy to report that the ponies did survive this round of cuts.
Okay, good. The ponies survived the cuts. One elephant in the room here, going with this animal metaphor, I guess, is that lawmakers did not get rid of the state's structural budget situation. Like we said before, this is really just the beginning.
It is. JVC members said they expect these budget problems to stick around for the next few years, and they might even get worse.
Brian, you've been covering this closely, and I know it still needs to pass both chambers of the legislature, but did anything surprise you with how the Budget Committee finally closed this out?
Oh, man, that question surprised me. I think one thing I'll say, they came into this with a really dire forecast, right? I mean, this was $1.2 billion they needed to cut. I think one thing that caught me a little bit off guard was, yes, we did see a lot of cuts to a lot of programs that lawmakers have been pushing the last few years. But at the end of the day, we still saw an increase for higher ed. We still saw a little bit of an increase for Medicaid, for K-12 schools. Through all of this, they were able to kind of avoid some really, really devastating stuff for the programs that people care about. But, we might be seeing more of this in the years to come.
That's it for this episode. Purplish is a production of member-supported Colorado Public Radio and the Colorado Capital News Alliance.
The CCNA is a collaboration between KUNC News, Colorado Public Radio, Rocky Mountain PBS, and the Colorado Sun, with support from news outlets throughout the state. Funding for the Alliance is provided in part by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting. I'm Brian Eason.
And I'm Benta Berkland. Our producer is Stephanie Wolf. This episode was edited by Megan Verlee and sound designed and engineered by Shane Rumsey. Our theme music is by Brad Turner.
Purplish will be back in your feeds next week. Subscribe now so you don't miss an episode.
This is Purplish from CPR News and the Colorado Capital News Alliance.